Welcome to Anatomy and Physiology 1. This will be the first lecture, which will cover the introduction to anatomy and physiology. So as we get started, we're going to talk in this class, we are going to define what anatomy is. So anatomy or human anatomy is the study of structure or form. I like to say structure or form of the human body. Human physiology or physiology is the study of function. So anatomy is the study of the form or structure, and physiology is the study of the function. The body's anatomy or structure, physiology, and function are always interrelated, which means the anatomy will always be related to the physiology. Now, how do we study anatomy and physiology? Well, there are several different ways we can study anatomy. We can study the human anatomy by system. So this examines individual organ systems like the cardiovascular system is the study of the heart, blood, and blood vessels. So if we wanted to study the anatomy of the heart, if we wanted to study the anatomy of the red blood cell or the white blood cells, or if we wanted to study the actual structure of blood vessels themselves, then we could study systemic anatomy. We can also study the anatomy by studying regional anatomy. This will examine the anatomy of the body regions, such as the head and neck. This is done quite often in anatomy and physiology course, where we are studying just the head and neck. In medicine, they study the otolaryngology, where the head and neck physicians are specialists in the anatomy of the head and the neck. So that's studying the body region. We can also study the surface anatomy of the body, and this examines the surface markings and may relate to structures underneath. So for instance, you probably have never seen the inside of a human being, but you probably know where on the surface you would point to if I said, put your hand over your heart. And that's because the surface, the heart is right over this specific surface. Most people know that. Some women, if they've had problems with their gallbladders, know that their gallbladder is in their upper right-hand corner. Some people may know where their appendix is. A child may say their stomach hurts. Now, they don't have any idea that their stomach is right underneath that surface, but that's one way we can study anatomy, is by studying the surface anatomy. We can also study anatomy by looking at it with our own eyes. So if you can examine a structure that can be seen with the unaided eye, so we don't have to have special microscopes, we don't have to have a magnifying glass, we can see it with the unaided eye. That's studying the anatomy, gross anatomy. So in medical school, for instance, medical students, their first year will take a course called gross anatomy, in which they will dissect an entire human being. And they will look at each of the systems. They will look at the cardiovascular and the skin integument system. That is studying gross anatomy by using their eyes. Also, in anatomy and physiology, we will study microscopic anatomy. That's much different than gross anatomy. Microscopic anatomy examines cells using a microscope. So if we look under the microscope at individual cells, that specific branch of microscopic anatomy is known as cytology. The suffix OLOGY means the study of, and the word CYTO, or the prefix cyto, means cell. So the term cytology means the study of cells. The term tissues or the study of tissues is known as histology. So hist, tissues, and then the suffix ology, the study of. So histology is the study of tissues. And then we can use the microscope in medicine to look at pathology. So ology is the study of, pathos means disease. The actual Latin translation means to suffer. So pathology is literally the study of the suffering of the body. So we can study anatomy several different ways. We can study the systemic anatomy. We can study the human body regionally. We can study surface anatomy. We can use our eyes and study anatomy. That's gross anatomy. We can use microscope. Now, how can we study physiology? Well, there are different ways we can study physiology, lots and lots of subfields. Physiology subfields are classified usually by the organ we are studying, such as neurophysiology. So neuro refers to the brain or spinal cord. Cardiophysiology refers to the heart. So the study of the function of the heart. So neurophysiology would be the study of the function of the brain or spinal cord. So anytime we use the word physiology, we are talking about the function of a system. Physiologists can also study other structural levels at the organization of the body, such as the chemical physiology or cellular physiology or tissue physiology. So for instance, most people know the name of the organelle that's found in the human cell that is responsible for producing energy. And this drawing usually reminds people that it is the mitochondria. The mitochondria is the organelle that's found in each living cell, each human living cell, I should say, that is responsible for converting our food and oxygen into energy. So physiologists can study the function of the mitochondria, and that's studying cellular physiology. So to review, we have talked about the study, how we study physiology. We've talked about different ways that we can study anatomy. And we started with talking about the definition of anatomy versus the definition of physiology. This concludes the first video in the anatomy and physiology class.